On the 14th of February 1992, Stefan Kiszko walked out of Wakefield Prison after serving 16 years for the murder of Leslie Molseed, an 11-year-old girl killed in Rochdale in 1975. He had not committed the murder. He could not have committed the murder. The biological evidence that proved he was incapable of committing the specific crime for which he was convicted had been in the possession of West Yorkshire Police since before his trial. The officers who conducted the investigation knew that the evidence existed. The evidence was not disclosed to the defense. Stefan Kiszko spent 16 years in maximum security prison for a murder that the police knew before his trial that he could not have committed. He was released in February 1992. He died in December 1993. He was 41 years old. He never recovered. In this video, we are counting down 11 British miscarriages of justice that you will not believe were allowed to happen. Not cases where the evidence was ambiguous. Cases where the evidence of innocence existed before or during the trial, where that evidence was withheld, suppressed, or fabricated, and where the people responsible for the wrongful conviction were either never prosecuted or received consequences that bore no relationship to what they had done. Stay with me to the end, because number one is a case so recent that the man at the center of it walked free less than 5 years ago, having spent 17 years in prison for a crime he did not commit, and the police officer whose failures contributed to his wrongful conviction is still serving. So hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and let's begin. In November 1987, a woman named Lynette White was murdered in a flat in Bute Town, Cardiff. 3 men, Stephen Miller, Youssef Abdullahi, and Tony Paris, were convicted of her murder in 1990. They became known as the Cardiff Three. Their convictions were quashed by the Court of Appeal in 1992. What the Court of Appeal found, and what the original jury had not been told, was the specific manner in which the confessions that formed the centerpiece of the prosecution case had been obtained. Stephen Miller, who had a low IQ, was interviewed by South Wales Police over 5 days, across 13 sessions, totaling approximately 13 hours of recorded interview time. During those interviews, Miller denied involvement in the murder approximately 300 times. Officers repeatedly told him that his co-accused had implicated him when they had not, that forensic evidence proved his presence when it did not, and that admitting responsibility was his only option. After approximately 13 hours of this, Miller confessed. The Court of Appeal found the confession had been obtained by oppression. It was excluded. The conviction collapsed. The real killer, Jeffrey Gaffour, was identified through DNA evidence in 2003. He was convicted in the same year. He had been known to South Wales Police during the original investigation. The 3 men who spent years in prison for a murder they did not commit received compensation. The police officers who conducted the interviews have not faced criminal prosecution. In November 1974, a coach carrying British soldiers and their families was bombed on the M62 motorway. 12 people died. Judith Ward was convicted of the M62 bombing and of 2 other IRA bombings in 1974. She was sentenced to life imprisonment. She served 18 years. Her conviction was quashed by the Court of Appeal in 1992, the same year as the Cardiff Three. What the Court of Appeal found was that Judith Ward's conviction had been secured through the fabrication and suppression of scientific evidence by the forensic scientists working for the prosecution, and through the non-disclosure of psychiatric evidence that showed Ward was a fantasist who had confessed to crimes she had not committed because she sought attention. The scientists who fabricated and suppressed evidence in the Judith Ward case were the same scientists or worked in the same forensic science service as those involved in the Birmingham Six and Guildford Four cases. The pattern of forensic science failure across the IRA bombing cases of the 1970s represents the most systematic failure of forensic science in British criminal justice history. No forensic scientist was ever convicted of a criminal offense in connection with the evidence fabrication that produced the wrongful convictions of Judith Ward, the Birmingham Six, and the Guildford Four. The forensic science service that employed them was eventually closed, decades later, for reasons that included concerns about its reliability. In November 1974, 2 IRA bombs exploded in Birmingham pubs, killing 21 people and injuring 182. 6 Irishmen living in Birmingham, Hugh Callaghan, Patrick Hill, Gerard Hunter, Richard McElkenny, William Power, and John Walker, were arrested, convicted, and sentenced to life imprisonment. They served a combined total of approximately 97 years in prison. Their convictions were quashed in 1991. The Birmingham Six case is the most prominent wrongful conviction case in British legal history, and the one that most directly precipitated legislative reform. But the prominence of the case has not produced the full accountability that its scale warranted. The Birmingham Six were subjected to physical assault during police custody. Confessions were obtained through violence. Forensic evidence was fabricated by Dr. Frank Skuse, whose grease test for explosives was shown to have produced false positives and whose scientific conclusions were unreliable. Dr. Skuse was found guilty of professional incompetence in 1985 and required to take early retirement. He was not prosecuted. The police officers who assaulted the men in custody were not prosecuted. The Director of Public Prosecutions decided in 1993 that there was insufficient evidence to prosecute those responsible. The Birmingham Six received compensation. The people responsible for 97 combined years of wrongful imprisonment faced no criminal consequences. Stefan Kiszko's case opened this video. It deserves its own entry because the specific nature of the failure in his case is distinct from every other case on this list. In every other case on this list, evidence was fabricated, withheld, or lost in ways that required retrospective investigation to establish. In the Kiszko case, the evidence of his innocence was produced before the trial, examined before the trial, and withheld before the trial. The biological evidence showed that Kiszko was infertile and could not have produced the semen found on the victim. This was known to the West Yorkshire Police forensic team before the trial began. The prosecution presented Kiszko's confession, obtained after extensive police interviewing, of a man with the mental age of a 12-year-old, without disclosing the biological evidence that proved the confession was false. Ronald Outeridge, the West Yorkshire Police forensic scientist who produced the report showing Kiszko could not have committed the crime, gave evidence at trial. He did not disclose the exculpatory finding. He testified to other aspects of the forensic evidence. The jury convicted. In 1991, Kiszko's solicitor discovered the suppressed evidence. The real killer, Robert Black, was never convicted of this specific murder, though he was convicted of 4 other child murders. Stefan Kiszko died 16 months after his release. The police officers who withheld the evidence were investigated. They were not prosecuted. In October 1974, IRA bombs exploded in 2 Guildford pubs, killing 5 people. 4 people, Gerard Conlon, Paul Hill, Carol Richardson, and Patrick Armstrong, were convicted of the bombings in 1975 and sentenced to life imprisonment. They served a combined total of approximately 60 years. Their convictions were quashed in 1989. Gerard Conlon's father, Giuseppe Conlon, was convicted separately of related charges, imprisoned, and died in prison in 1980. He was posthumously exonerated. His case formed the basis of the film In the Name of the Father. The Guildford Four's convictions were quashed after it was established that police had fabricated evidence and that officers had altered interview notes to make it appear that admissions had been made when they had not. The actual Balcombe Street gang members who carried out the Guildford bombings confessed to the attacks in 1977, while the Guildford Four were already serving their sentences. Their confessions were not acted upon. It took 12 further years before the Court of Appeal quashed the convictions. An inquiry conducted by Sir John May found that Surrey police had fabricated evidence. No officer was prosecuted. The Guildford Four received compensation. Giuseppe Conlon, who died in prison, did not live to see his exoneration. Sam Hallam was convicted in 2005 of the murder of a trainee chef named Essam Eid in London. He was 17 years old at the time of the conviction. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 12 years. He served 7 years before his conviction was quashed by the Court of Appeal in 2012. What makes the Sam Hallam case specific to this list is the nature of the alibi evidence. At the time of Essam Eid's death, Sam Hallam was elsewhere. This was established by photographic evidence from a camera phone showing Hallam at a location away from the murder scene at the relevant time. This evidence existed before the trial. It was not placed before the jury. Additionally, there were witnesses who had information about Hallam's whereabouts that was not adequately investigated before the trial. The Court of Appeal found that the conviction was unsafe because of the failure to investigate and disclose the alibi evidence. Hallam had maintained his innocence throughout his imprisonment. The specific form of the failure, in his case, is the non-investigation and non-disclosure of evidence that established he was not at the scene. A 17-year-old was convicted of murder and served 7 years because the investigative process did not follow up alibi evidence that photographs had already established. The Metropolitan Police conducted a review. No officer faced prosecution. In April 1999, BBC television presenter Jill Dando was shot dead outside her home in Fulham, London. The murder shocked the country. In 2001, a man named Barry George was convicted of the murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. In 2008, his conviction was quashed by the Court of Appeal. A retrial was ordered. A jury acquitted him in 2008. He had served 8 years. Barry George was a man with a history of stalking celebrities, a history of fantasizing about violent events, and a low IQ. He had no specific connection to Jill Dando that the prosecution could establish, and no established motive. The prosecution's case rested substantially on a single particle of firearms discharge residue found in the pocket of a coat belonging to George, which forensic scientists testified could have been from a gun. The defense argued that the particle was consistent with contamination from many sources and that its evidential value was minimal. The Court of Appeal agreed that without the firearms residue evidence, the conviction was unsafe. At the retrial, after the forensic evidence was properly challenged, the jury acquitted. The murder of Jill Dando remains unsolved. Barry George, a vulnerable man with a history of mental health problems and celebrity fixation, spent 8 years in prison for a murder that the justice system eventually accepted he probably did not commit. No one has been convicted of Jill Dando's murder. In September 1978, a 13-year-old newspaper boy named Carl Bridgewater was shot dead while delivering papers to a farmhouse in Staffordshire. 4 men, Michael Hickey, Vincent Hickey, James Robinson, and Patrick Molloy, were convicted of the murder. They became known as the Bridgewater Four. Patrick Molloy died in prison in 1981. The remaining 3 were released in 1997 after serving approximately 20 years. Their convictions were quashed by the Court of Appeal in that year. The case involved one of the most significant document falsification scandals in British policing history. The prosecution relied substantially on a confession by Vincent Hickey that was obtained through oppressive police interviewing and that Hickey subsequently retracted. It also relied on a confession by Patrick Molloy, obtained under similar circumstances, in which Molloy alleged that a police officer had altered the document after he signed it to include admissions he had not made. Molloy died maintaining this account. Forensic document examination, after the case was reopened, established that the confession document had been altered. Detective Chief Inspector Graham Leake, who conducted the original investigation, was found by a judicial review to have behaved improperly, but was not prosecuted. Patrick Molloy died in prison before the exoneration. His family received compensation on his behalf. He was exonerated posthumously. He served 3 years for a murder he did not commit, and died before anyone acknowledged that. Victor Nealon was convicted in 1997 of the attempted rape of a woman in Redditch, Worcestershire. He was sentenced to 7 years but was kept in prison under a public protection provision that prevented his release until the Parole Board was satisfied he no longer posed a risk. Because he maintained his innocence throughout, and because maintaining innocence makes it impossible to complete the rehabilitation programs that the Parole Board requires for release in such cases, he served 17 years. His conviction was quashed by the Court of Appeal in 2013 after DNA evidence extracted from the victim's clothing identified the presence of an unknown male whose profile did not match Nealon. The DNA evidence had been available for testing for years before the test that produced the result was conducted. The specific question of why the DNA was not tested sooner is one that the legal process has addressed in terms of the rules governing CCRC referral timelines and the availability of testing technology, rather than in terms of who bore responsibility for the delay. Victor Nealon was released in 2013. He was eligible for compensation under a scheme for wrongly convicted prisoners. The government refused to pay compensation on the grounds that he had not proven his innocence beyond reasonable doubt, the standard being higher for compensation than for the quashing of a conviction. He sued. In 2019, the Supreme Court ruled in his favor. He received compensation after 6 years of fighting for it, 17 years after a conviction that DNA evidence eventually showed was wrong. Between 1999 and 2015, the Post Office prosecuted over 700 sub-postmasters and sub-postmistresses for theft, fraud, and false accounting on the basis of evidence produced by the Horizon computer system, a software system supplied by Fujitsu. The Horizon system had bugs that produced false accounting shortfalls in the accounts of sub-postmasters. The Post Office knew the system had problems. It prosecuted sub-postmasters anyway. Sub-postmasters who reported the discrepancies were told they were the only one experiencing problems, which was false. Some went to prison, some were made bankrupt, some lost their homes, some took their own lives, some died before the scale of the wrongdoing was acknowledged. The Post Office used its status as a private prosecutor to bring the prosecutions without the oversight that the Crown Prosecution Service would have applied. The Horizon scandal is the largest miscarriage of justice in British legal history in terms of numbers of people affected. The Post Office Horizon IT inquiry, which began in 2021 and continues, has taken evidence from hundreds of affected sub-postmasters and from Fujitsu employees. It has established that the Post Office knew about the Horizon bugs while prosecuting sub-postmasters for discrepancies produced by those bugs. As of 2024, mass exonerations have been enacted through legislation. Many of those wrongly convicted have not yet received compensation. Some died waiting. And now we have reached number 1. In 2003, Andrew Malkinson was convicted of the rape and attempted murder of a woman in Greater Manchester. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 7 years. He maintained his innocence throughout his imprisonment. Because he maintained his innocence, he did not engage with the sex offender treatment programs that the Parole Board required for his release. He served 17 years. In 2023, his conviction was quashed by the Court of Appeal after DNA evidence identified the actual perpetrator, a man named Andrew Sutton, who had prior convictions for rape. The DNA evidence that identified Sutton had been available for testing since the early 2000s. The Criminal Cases Review Commission had twice rejected Malkinson's applications for a referral to the Court of Appeal before eventually referring the case. The CCRC's handling of the Malkinson case was the subject of a formal review that found serious failings in the Commission's processing of his applications. The Greater Manchester police officer, whose investigative failures contributed to the wrongful conviction of Andrew Malkinson, was, at the time of the Court of Appeal judgment in 2023, still serving as a police officer. He had not been suspended, he had not been charged. Andrew Malkinson spent 17 years in prison for a rape committed by a man whose DNA was in the database. He was released in 2023. The officer is still serving. The actual rapist, Andrew Sutton, was convicted in 2024.